Welcome back to Coding with Josh. This is part 3 of our series using UI Faces API with ReactJS and Context API. In this video, we will be discussing the React Context API and the team component that we will create that will consume the context, and we will pass in the data that we receive from the API call into the avatar component. Let's get started. To begin, let's create a new file, and I'm going to name that context.js, and then I'm going to create another file called global context.js. Before we make the context that our application is going to use, I just want to talk briefly about the Context API itself. Now, the Context API is designed to share data that can be considered global. Also, we can avoid passing props through intermediate components. Now, in the past, if we needed to pass props down through the generations of components, you'd have to pass a prop into the parent, you'd have to pass a prop into the child, and you'd have to pass that data all the way down to the component that you needed to use. So when we start creating our component in the global context, we are actually going to add a provider which accepts a value prop that contains objects of data that will be used in the application. And in order to consume that, we will need to use the consumer property to gain access to that data. In the context.js, this will be our context that we will use throughout the application. It is different than our global context, but I'll show you what the differences are going to be as we move forward. The context.js will actually only consist of 2 lines for this example. In the global context is where we'll flesh out more of the data that we will be using. So let's create the context that we will be using throughout our application. Import, create context from React. And then we will export the create context function. We'll save that. We'll create a section for utils. And then we are actually going to import the API that we created in part number 2. And I'm just going to call that Axios. We could actually name this UI Faces, and that would be perfectly fine as well. It would be a little bit more descriptive if we were using multiple API calls from Axios, and we had it structured the way that we had set up in part 2. So yeah, let's just run with this. From utils API and the Axios API that we're going to call. We will also import our context that we just created. Great. We will export default because we are creating a class-based component. Global context extends component. Then I'll render and return. Great. Okay. So to start, we are going to make a state that has the object that we are going to be using. So state equals, and because we're fetching back avatars, I'm just going to simply name it avatars. and this will be an array of objects. Then I will do get UI faces, and we'll use this to fetch the data from the API. So UI faces dot get. Now, because our Axios API already has the URL and the headers needed, we don't need to actually pass in a string here. So we can type null, and then we do need to pass back params for what we want to fetch. So we'll type in params, and this is an object. We are going to limit the number of responses to 6, and you can either set this to random if you want random results, or it will return the top 6 results every single time you hit refresh. I'll do random. I might take this out later, but we'll see. Great. So this will go and hit the API, and if a response comes back with data, then we will need to get the response and use that data. To consume this response, we're actually going to set the state parameter that we just created. So we will return this dot set state avatars, and this is going to equal response dot data. If we want, we can actually add a catch. And we can log that out to the console if an error comes back. Great. Now we need to consume this function. To do this, we are going to tap into the class-based component hook of component did mount. And what this is going to do is when this component mounts, when the app starts, then we are going to call this function. And then we will go through and execute all of this. If a response comes back that has data, then we will set our state. This state only exists in this component. And this is where the context API comes in. So now I will use the context that we previously created. Since we will not have additional HTML tags outside of the context provider, I can remove this and type in context provider. Now the context provider takes a value that is an object. We can pass API data that we get back. We can actually pass click functions that need to happen throughout the application. There's a variety of things that we can add to this provider that we can tap into elsewhere in the application. So we are passing back an object, and I'm going to pass back avatars, and then this is going to be this dot state dot avatars. Going to close this out. And because we will be wrapping our application in this, I'm going to add this dot props dot children. I'm going to save that. I'm going to go up to routes. Oops. I'm going to go up to app.js. I'm going to comment providers, import global context from context and global context. So because we are not going to consume the context, when we go to the team page and we want to consume the context, we will actually use the context.js that we created earlier. So there's a little bit of nuance to this, but once you get your head wrapped around it, it becomes easy to understand. Alright, gonna save that. Let's go create the team component where we will use the context.consume to fetch the data from the global context. All right, this will be a class-based component. We will pass in the avatars component after we create it. And we will also need the context so we can consume the global data. Now export default class team extends component. We will have our render and our return. And this will have the open and closed angled brackets because we will have multiple lines of HTML. So here we will have an H1 with our team. Now we'll create a div, and in here we'll use the context.consumer. Now in here we need to fetch the data out of the context. So we will have context, and this is a function. So this is a parameter. You can add parentheses to it if you'd like, but because it is just a single parameter, you don't have to have the parentheses around it. Now in here we'll have context.avatars.map. Now the map is going to, because the avatars is an array of objects, we can use .map to loop through those objects and get the data out of those objects. So the map has a callback function that we can set multiple parameters on. So the first parameter will be our data that we are getting from the context provider. And next is an index, which is auto-generated. Because React uses a virtual DOM, that key and index are required, so when React goes to update that element, it has a pointer for that element to update. So we'll finish our callback function. Just to make sure that this is working, we're going to return a div with our data.name. And we will add our key and index so we don't get an error when we run this. I'm going to save all of that. To make sure this works, let's test it out. Yarn start. One thing that we forgot to do is we forgot to add the team to our home page. So previously we had added a comment for components, and now we will import team from components team, team. And then down here, we will add in our team component. Save that, and the app refreshed, but our team is not there. Oh, I see what the issue is. It's because we are returning back a div from our map that we do not need the curly brackets because we are returning back an HTML element. So now if we save this and go back to our app, you'll see that we have our names from the API. That concludes part 3 of this series. In part 4, we are actually going to start creating more views and more components so that we have a more fleshed out website, and we will also start getting into styling it so it looks like our previous example of this. See you soon.